So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am going to briefly touch upon the century of humiliation, and its impact on the Chinese society. Both the speakers before me had brought out very important points, which I will only request that you carry in your mind because Professor Amrita talked about political ideology and the way Chinese Communist Party has shaped its ideology and uses it. Mr. Rajaram spoke about the need for control and the need to be responsive also. Both these points, I will just request you to keep it in mind because it has some direct relevance to what I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to, this is the outline of my talk. I will talk about symbolism in national political culture, century of shame and its timeline. The first and second opium wars because it conveys a point which I in China, Chinese polity and the century of shame. I have just used the word shame, it's humiliation. Impact on the Chinese society. Of course, some lessons as I see it from this century of humiliation, which China has probably drawn. We are all aware that national memories have a huge role to play in the shaping of the concept of nationhood, the concept of national identity, and the nation's very existence. I don't have to give you examples. All of us are familiar from Americas to Australia. Every nation cherishes some memories, good as well as bad, and the political establishment, the society, even the economic dimension of the nation uses these memories to further their thoughts or ideologies and convert them into actions. We are all familiar with this. In fact, a learned scholar called Pode made a very interesting remark that forging a country's collective memory is an integral part of Chinese, that's what the Chinese have done, integral part of nation building, and supported by so many other studies by Penbaker and Smith and Bell and Callahan. But most notably, Ernest Gellner, who is considered to be the father of this thought, national memories and the role that they play in forging national identities. He has always insisted that nations and nationalism are real and they are powerful sociological phenomena, even if their reality is quite different from the tale told about them by the nationalists themselves. The truth may be different, but the way it is being told matters. That is the crux of what Gellner found. Again, Smith found that if there is no memory, then there is no identity. If there is no identity, then there is no nation. So all nations need memories. The studies conducted by Purdue University and other universities show that two generations of Chinese, the generation of Chinese who grew up in Mao's time, shall we say 1949 till recently, say about 12 years back or 15 years back, and the millennial generation, the 2000 onwards generation, which is almost 20 years plus now, the millennial generation, both of them have different perceptions about Chinese polity. The earlier generation, for reasons which my predecessors, the speakers have highlighted, have been probably forced to think the way they were told to think. But the millennials, with access to their internet, with access to social media, with the access to the larger world, because we are all aware that China has opened up. Okay. With that kind of a opening up, the millennials who are in touch everywhere, they do not view the Chinese polity the way the earlier generation views. But what these studies by Purdue and other universities in conjunction with or by themselves, even on Chinese diaspora abroad, particularly in America and Canada, they have found that the new millennials have a higher sense of nationalism. They feel proud to be Chinese. They want to celebrate their culture and tradition, even though they may have reservations about their polity, that is the CCP and the political establishment, whatever has been discussed earlier. Now, when we talk about China's century of humiliation, so what do the Chinese consider as the components of that humiliation? I have just tried to list the historical incidents. It started with the defeat in the First Opium War of 1839 to 1842 at the hands of the British. The unequal treaties which followed, which China still refers to them as unequal treaties, though the countries which import the treaties on Chinese, they don't say it is unequal. But the China categorically, Chinese historians and scholars, they say they're unequal treaties. In particular, they refer to the Treaty of Nanking, the Treaty of Whampoa, the Treaty of Aigun, and the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Defeat in the Second Opium War, that is, which followed after the first, in between 1856 to 1860, and most importantly, the sacking of the old summer palace by the British and the French forces. The signing of the Treaty of Aigun in 1858 and the Treaty of Peking in 1860 during the Second Opium War, which ceded Outer Manchuria to Russia. This was the beginning of slicing of China. There was a mention about the concept of sovereignty. There is in the earlier talks and the inaugural session. China considers even the adjoining countries, many of them, at least some portions of the adjoining countries. There are 14 neighbors that China has. Those territories, China considers it to be their own. It is part and parcel of what you now call as the Celestial Empire, and the Son of Heaven was the boss. But what happened in 1858 and 1860? It started to be sliced away to other people. It started with the Russians. Outer Manchuria went to Russians. Then the partial defeat during the Sino-French War, that is 1884 to 1855. Loss of suzerainty over Vietnam. Annam was so close to Chinese, they never considered it anything other than China. It was part of China. And its influence on the Indo-China Peninsula, it started deteriorating because of the defeat at the hands of the French. Then defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895. Again, the Eight-Nation Alliance and their invasion to suppress the Boxer Uprising in 1899-1901 and the resulting Boxer Protocol, which imposed reparations in excess of the Chinese government's total gross tax revenue. The simultaneous Russian invasion of Manchuria again in 1900. The British expedition to Tibet in 1903-04. The 21 demands in 1915 for an advantageous loan and local government control by Japan because Japan had already defeated China. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919, in which German territories in China were handed over to Japan, and that led to an imperialist May 4th movement in China. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria, again 1931-1932. The Sino-Japanese War of 1937-1945, and most importantly, the Nanking Massacre. We are all aware as students of history that in Nanking alone, the Japanese forces beheaded 44,000 Chinese in one day. And these are not memories which a nation is likely to forget, and that is precisely what the Chinese did. They did not forget, but they institutionalized it. How did they do? We will see after a brief look at what happened during the First and Second Opium War. Here is the data which I have given. From 1760, the Opium War obviously was courtesy opium. This is the only war in the world which has been fought because of a substance, which is what we call a psychedelic substance or banned substance or a drug, whatever we want to call. But in 1760s from India, 1,000 chests were being smuggled into China, both on land and as well as by sea. By the 1800s, it had increased to 4,000 chests. 1820s, it increased to 12,000 chests. And by 1835, 30 to 35, it became 30,000 chests. And in 1838, It became 40,000 chests, that is 2,500 tons of opium into China. One chest approximately weighed 140 pounds. But what is important to note is one chest yielded a profit of 1,000 pounds sterling in those days. You can guesstimate the value now. So the British energetically encouraged poppy growing in India, and they started pumping that opium into China, which was used for purchasing tea and porcelain and whatever else that China had to offer. And on top of that, because the value of the opium supplied was far excessive of what the exports were, China even had to pay by silver. We are all aware that sometime around 1758, the gold standard was introduced. The silver standard was done away with, economically speaking. And when it was done away with, China had to pay more. And by 1830s, the scale of the problem forced the Chinese government to respond. Obviously, the country was being drained of silver to pay for the opium. Its administration was being corrupted by foreigners, and the extent of addiction, estimated at 12 million addicts at that time, was seen as a threat to both the state and the society. In March 1839, the emperor sent a special commissioner, Lin, to Canton to stamp out their trade once and for all. But what happened? Lin confined the British merchants in Canton to the European factories, holding them hostage until the opium held offshore was surrendered. After 6 weeks, the superintendent of trade, that is Captain Charles Elliot, capitulated and ordered the surrender of 10,000 chests, which the Chinese destroyed. That was the beginning of the first opium war. Now what happened? In first opium war, I've just taken only one instance to just highlight as to what is being portrayed inside China as what happened. But the sources from which I have taken this information are all from the West. The British capture of the port of Tinhai in early October 1841. The port was bombarded by Wellesley. All these are all ships' names. Wellesley, which had 74 guns, the Conway and the Alligator, 28 guns each, the Cruiser and Allegheny, 18 guns each, and another dozen smaller vessels carrying up to 10 guns. In 9 minutes, they fired 15 broadsides into the effectively defenseless town before landing troops to storm the ruins. Then rape and pillage followed. The shelling of the towns continued as the British troops moved in. According to the Indian Gazette, published in India, British India, a more complete pillage could not be conceived. The plunder only ceased when there was nothing to take or destroy. It was during this war that the Hindi word loot entered the English dictionary. Though we spell it as L-O-O-T, the Hindustani word we are all familiar with. It entered the British because there can never be any better word to describe what happened in Tinhai or elsewhere. Close behind the warships came the opium ships. Lord Jocelyn, the military secretary to the expeditionary force, in his account of the war argued, and I quote, "However hateful it may appear, a source of great benefit to the Indian government, returning, I have heard, a revenue of upwards of 2.5 million pounds sterling yearly, cannot be just given away because the Chinese said no." So the opium war ensued. But it is not only the governments or the East India Company or the other French and Dutch and German and other companies which are involved. Even private profiteers from Britain were involved. For example, Jardine Matheson was the most successful of the opium smuggling companies, and they are still a major financial and trading company today. Jardine's partner at that time, James Matheson, became an MP in the 1840s, sitting in the Commons for 25 years. He went on to become the governor of Bank of England, chairman of a great P&O shipping line, and the second largest landowner in Britain. He bought the island of Lewis in Scotland and spent over 500,000 sterling pounds building himself a castle there out of the profits made from opium trade. Right. So therefore, this opium trade and the examples which I have given and the other instances that have taken place in the Chinese history, which I had listed earlier, cumulatively referred to as the century of humiliation. How did it affect the popular culture in China? Again, I have to go back to 1839 because Charles Eliot, the British Superintendent of Trade, wrote a letter to Commissioner Lin when he landed in Canton regarding the trade issues between the two countries. In that letter, Charles Eliot referred to Britain and China as two countries. The very mention of two countries by Charles Eliot angered the commissioner so much that he returned the letter saying, "No place under heaven can be referred to as an equal to our celestial empire." This, I am very sure, all of you are able to link with today's China. There is no question of any other country trying to compare it with China as an equal, and that is the kind of a mentality which has been built through what was mentioned earlier also, propaganda, and a very good propaganda at that. I will give you some details a little later. In Harrison 1972 study, he considered that the rewriting of the Chinese history by the CCP as the most massive attempt at ideological re-education in human history. Obviously, China's population is so much. The Patriotic Education Campaign of 1991, I'll come back to it a little later again, is 1991 is yet another step by the CCP at re-educating the masses from the class struggle narrative to a patriotic narrative in which the West is portrayed as the cause of China's suffering. So who is the villain? The West. Very clearly portrayed through a very calibrated propaganda education program. Some of the details I'll share with you a little later. This even replaced this narrative which was built in the 1991 to 1994, rather 1995, I'll put it that way, even replaced the Mao's victor's narrative into one of victim's narrative. China became the victim. China was portrayed as a victim suffering at the hands of the foreigners. And therefore, there is a need to regenerate that pride. There is a need to make China powerful again. All of us know that Xi Jinping, when he took over as the president for the first time in May 2013, he had called the most powerful, all the generals and Politburo members and everyone who mattered in China to Tiananmen Square. And in his address, it's in public domain, in his address, he mentioned only two things. First, he referred to the century of humiliation, and he said, the time has come for China to avenge, number one. Second, he referred to the Silk Roads. He said all the prosperity, the economic prowess of the Celestial Empire came from the Silk Road, and therefore the time has again come for China to revive it. And now we know that China is working on it, and how it is working on it is in our knowledge very well. Right. Did this narrative by the Chinese party actually go down the throat of the Chinese populace? Yes, there are a couple of instances which I would like to quote. Okay. The Tibetan uprising in 2008, or what the Chinese call as the 314 riots, March 14th riots. The reaction of overseas Chinese women, middle-aged Chinese women, is here, and I quote, "We couldn't believe that our government was being so weak and cowardly. The Dalai Lama is trying to separate China, and it is not acceptable at all. We must crack down on the rioters." And this was reported by New York Times because this Chinese expatriate lives in New York. Again, scholars like Zheng Wang, who had studied this phenomena of national memory and this education campaign or patriotic education campaign, find that even the internal social movements in China have taken a distinct reorientation from that of anti-corruption and anti-dictatorial or pro-democracy. From this stance, that is anti-corruption, anti-dictatorial, pro-democracy stance of the 1980s, to those of external-oriented anti-Western from the 1990s, a very carefully cultivated program. What is that program? We will just see. What did the Chinese CCP and therefore the government do? In 1995, the Ministry of Civil Affairs announced the selection of 100 national-level patriotic education bases. They are referred to as patriotic education bases. These 100 sites will receive central funding and would serve as models for local-level patriotic education bases. What are those patriotic education bases? This is concerning external conflicts, that is anti-Japanese. There are 20 sites in China. Opium wars, there are 7 sites. Korean war, 4 sites. In all 100 sites, 100 sites. China-India war, 1 site. War with Dutch or Taiwan, 1 site. Okay. Like that, if you see down the line, for each aspect which is covered by those items which were mentioned as part of the century of humiliation, they have very carefully curated and created education basis where it is compulsory. Yes, it is compulsory because even Mr. Rajaram talked about control. There is a control. It's compulsory, but the fact is that remember that young children, school children, college children, adults, everyone is taken there and they are talked to as to how China has been shamed and why China should rise out of that shame and therefore become the celestial empire again. Okay. Therefore, this popular culture of carefully cultivating this education basis has had some effect. There are contra opinions also, which I will just mention. Okay. But before I do that, I have to go back again and see why did the polity choose to utilize the century of humiliation as a tool for reforming, shall we say, public opinion? All right. Okay. What happened in Poland and Hungary in 1989? All of us are aware. The Polish United Workers' Party, which was actually a huge, symbol of communism in Europe and very close to China also, I believe. It initially, when 1989 happened, when the Berlin Wall came down, it initially tried to introduce reforms, what you call as democratic reforms, participatory reforms. But the introduction of the very reforms and internal dynamics and political pressure and pull inside PUWP itself pull down PUWP, and we know now PUWP is history. Okay, Poland is not having any kind of this thing with PUWP anymore. Okay, we all heard of Lech Walesa, but that's history now, right? And the same thing happened in Hungary, which was again another epitome of communist empire. When these pro-democracy intents were introduced by the communist parties there, the country's communist system and the party system collapsed, and they could not resist what they call as the bourgeois liberal ideals sweeping into the larger society and the party politics itself. So,
Shini, sorry to interrupt you. How much time do you want?
Maybe 3-4 minutes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sir. When the Tiananmen happened in 1989, the Chinese polity woke up because they had only one single agenda. The agenda was this bourgeois liberal ideals, which was being used as a dark and threatening place for China by the Western countries, should be prevented. How do you prevent? It's only by switching to what we call, as I have given the 4 re-education objectives which Deng himself laid down. There were party people, there were two sides of the party. The first, Li Peng and Yao and Deng Xiaoping, advocating control, total control, and Hu and Zhao and other people advocating liberalism. There are differences of opinion, which was mentioned earlier also. But when Deng introduced these 4-point objectives in 1991, it became the mantra for China. And that is how they embarked upon this history education reform as a fundamental strategy to defend against the peaceful evolution plot of international hostile powers. This is the beginning of the reforming of the society. Now, when we look at the various, again, studies which have been conducted, this study incidentally was conducted in collaboration with the Chinese University in USA. And this study showed that the modern millennial Chinese, if you see the percentage 47 plus 44, okay, they are proud to be Chinese, though they have reservations about the polity. But overall, their pride, which has been kindled through this program that China has massively launched, and Mr. Z has embarked upon further this thing, which is reported by Wall Street Journal also, given the citation here, has had distinct impact on the Chinese society in converting that century of humiliation as a motivation for taking China forward, with people believing that the country is moving forward. And they are not wrong, because of 3-4 instances, which I would like to just give you as an example. By 2019, we know China's GDP had reached 99.09 trillion yuan. The economic performance of China need not be highlighted. Again, in 2013, they launched that Belt and Road Initiative. We know that 90 countries are part and parcel of that Belt and Road Initiative. We can keep saying checkbook diplomacy, we can keep saying all other terms, but the fact is that we cannot ignore that Chinese have been successful in expanding their so-called Silk Road, even up to Italy and Spain. They have, even Hungary is part of the program. Bulgaria is part, everybody is part of 90 countries. And they have very carefully also accommodated private enterprise. Mr. Rajaram spoke about it, so I will not mention too much, but there is a calibrated moderation. And in terms of economic strength and military strength, China has grown. We all know. And this is, Admiral Doe from Novarissimo, who is commanding USS Theodore Roosevelt during the exercise year before last in the South China Sea. He made a statement: we are seeing larger number of aircraft, larger number of ships available to the Chinese military being utilized on a daily basis. So the capacity has clearly increased. So what is the lesson they have learned? They have learned that powerful military is required, coupled with powerful economics and a propaganda campaign through education, to bind the nation together and project an image that China is indeed something to be proud of by the Chinese. With that, gentlemen, I close. Thank you very much for the opportunity. But I just flashed on slide. If you wish to read, you're most welcome, because it portrays 3 essentially false beliefs about modern China in other parts of the world. That economics and democracy are 2 sides of the same coin. No, they are not. And China has proved it. Authoritarian political systems cannot be legitimate. Again, China has disproved it. Chinese live, work, and invest like Westerners. Again, disproved. All these 3 false beliefs, I will not say false beliefs, but this is what Harvard Business Review says. So I will use the same term. These false beliefs that we try to use for assessing China are making it difficult for us to understand China. So unless and until we try and understand China in Chinese own terms, it will not be possible for us to evolve the correct tactics to deal with a country called China. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, sir.